What happens when a system built to protect becomes the very thing that violates? When a woman with a clipboard and a rulebook decides that a service dog is a threat and learns too late that the law doesn't bend to her illusion of control. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about power, perception, and the moment silence turns into resistance. They say the HOA exists to preserve harmony, to maintain standards, to ensure that every blade of grass bends in the same direction. But what they don't say, what they never say, is that beneath the surface of uniformity lies a hunger for control, a quiet war against difference, and a culture that rewards the loudest voice in the room, even when it's wrong. I moved into this neighborhood not for the aesthetics, not for promise of order, but for the quiet. Because quiet, for someone like me, isn't just peace, it's survival. My service dog, Atlas, isn't a pet. He's a lifeline. He's trained to detect the shifts in my body that I can't feel, the signals I miss, the danger I don't see coming. But to Karen, he was just a dog, just fur and teeth and noise, just another disruption in her curated world of beige fences and laminated bylaws. She never asked what he did. She never asked who he was. She saw him and decided he didn't belong. And in that moment, I saw the truth. Karen didn't care about rules. She cared about control. And control, when unchecked, becomes cruelty. She started small, complaints about barking that never happened, notes about leash length, passive-aggressive comments at HOA meetings. But entitlement doesn't stay small. It grows. It metastasizes. It convinces itself that its discomfort is a moral compass. And Karen's compass pointed straight at Atlas. I tried to explain. I brought documentation. I quoted federal law. But logic doesn't penetrate delusion. She smiled, nodded, and escalated, because escalation is how systems like hers survive. They wear you down. They make you question your reality. They turn your lifeline into a liability. And the neighborhood watched, not with outrage, but with indifference, because indifference is easier than confrontation, and confrontation is punished. I began to feel the walls closing in, not physically, but psychologically. Every walk with Atlas felt like a protest. Every glance from a neighbor felt like surveillance. And Karen stood at the center of it all, armed with her clipboard and her certainty. She believed she was protecting something, but what she was really doing was erasing something. Erasing nuance, erasing need, erasing humanity. And in that erasure, I saw the blueprint of every system that has ever punished the vulnerable in the name of order. Atlas didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He didn't disrupt. He existed. And existence in Karen's world was the crime. I started documenting everything, not for revenge, but for survival. Because survival, when threatened, becomes meticulous. I recorded interactions. I saved letters. I built a timeline. And in that timeline, I saw the pattern. A slow, deliberate campaign to remove what she couldn't control. But control is an illusion. And illusions, when confronted with truth, begin to crack. Karen didn't know that Atlas was federally protected. She didn't care. She believed her discomfort was law. And belief, when weaponized, becomes dangerous. I began to wonder, how many others have been erased before me? How many stories have been silenced by the weight of conformity? How many truths have been buried beneath the HOA's manicured surface? Atlas wasn't just my service dog. He was my mirror. He reflected the discomfort Karen couldn't name. And discomfort, when ignored, becomes aggression. I knew something was coming. I didn't know when. I didn't know how. But I knew, because systems like hers don't stop until they're forced to. And force, in this case, would come not from me, but from the law. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those days that begins with routine and ends with rupture. I had taken Atlas out for his usual walk, the one we did every morning, the one that kept my body regulated and my mind grounded. He was calm, focused, tethered to me not just by a leash, but by trust. And then Karen appeared. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deliberately, like she had rehearsed the moment in her mind 100 times and was now ready to perform. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She didn't hesitate. She raised a canister and sprayed. The hiss of aerosol cut through the air like a warning shot, and Atlas recoiled, eyes blinking, body tense. instincts flaring. I froze. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I couldn't believe it was happening. How do you respond when someone weaponizes their discomfort against your survival? How do you speak when your breath is stolen by disbelief? Karen stood there, satisfied, righteous, convinced that she had done something brave. But bravery isn't violence. And violence, when directed at the vulnerable, is cowardice. I shouted. I demanded answers. I called the police. And in that moment, the system began to fracture, because systems like the HOA are built on the assumption that their members will never be challenged, that their authority will never be questioned, that their actions will never be scrutinized. But scrutiny had arrived. The officers came quickly, too quickly for Karen to rewrite the narrative. I showed them the footage. I showed them the documentation. I showed them the law. And the law, unlike Karen, doesn't bend to emotion. It bends to evidence. The Americans with Disabilities Act is clear. Interfering with a service animal is a federal offense, not a misunderstanding, not a disagreement, a crime. Karen tried to explain. She said Atlas scared her. She said she didn't know. But ignorance isn't innocence, and fear isn't justification. The officers listened. They asked questions. They took statements. And then they took her, not with force, but with finality. She was handcuffed, escorted, silenced, not by me, but by the very system she thought she controlled. And as she disappeared into the back of the cruiser, I felt something unexpected, grief. Not for her, but for the illusion that community means protection, that neighbors mean safety, that rules mean fairness. Because none of those things are true when power is unchecked. Atlas recovered, physically at least. But trust, once violated, doesn't heal easily. He became more alert, more cautious, more distant. And I understood, because I had changed too. I no longer walked with ease. I walked with vigilance. I no longer waved at neighbors. I watched them. I no longer believed in the system. I questioned it. Karen's act wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It revealed the cracks in the foundation, the rot beneath the surface, the danger of unchecked entitlement. And in that revelation, I found resolve, not to retaliate, but to rebuild, to speak, to expose. Because exposure is the first step to transformation. And transformation, once begun, cannot be undone. After Karen was taken away, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like exposure, the kind of silence that follows a scream, not because the scream was heard, but because it couldn't be ignored. The neighborhood, once a curated illusion of civility, began to fracture, not with chaos, but with clarity. People who had once smiled politely now looked away. Conversations became shorter. Eyes darted. And the HOA, that ever-present specter of suburban control, went into damage control. They issued statements, vague, sanitized, full of legal padding and moral emptiness. They spoke of unfortunate misunderstandings, ongoing investigations, and commitment to community standards. But no one believed them, because belief requires trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't mend with press releases. I became a symbol, not by choice, but by necessity. The person who had caused the incident, the one who had brought attention, the one who had disrupted the peace. But peace built on silence isn't peace. It's paralysis. And I refused to be paralyzed. I spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. I told my story. I explained what Atlas meant to me. I explained what Karen had done. I explained what the law says. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. Neighbors who had once ignored me began to ask questions. Some apologized. Some defended Karen. But most were quiet. Quiet in a way that suggested reflection, not avoidance. The HOA tried to reassert control. They called meetings. They revised policies. They reminded everyone of decorum. But decorum is a mask. And masks, once removed, cannot be worn again without suspicion. I received letters, anonymous, of course, some supportive, some threatening, some confused. And in those letters, I saw the spectrum of discomfort. The fear of change, the fear of confrontation, the fear of being wrong. But being wrong is not a failure. It's a beginning. A neighbor named Marcus, who had never spoken to me before, knocked on my door with a cup of coffee and a question. What can we do to make this right? It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a crack in the wall. And cracks, when nurtured, become openings. I started attending HOA meetings, not to fight, but to witness, to remind them that silence has a cost, that exclusion has consequences, that power, when abused, will be held accountable. Karen's absence was palpable. Her house stood quiet, her lawn overgrown, her influence evaporated, but her legacy lingered, not as authority, but as caution, a reminder of what happens when control becomes cruelty. The neighborhood began to change, not dramatically, but meaningfully. People started questioning the rules, questioning the roles, questioning the rituals of silence they had inherited. And in that questioning, I saw hope. Not naive hope, but earned hope. The kind that comes after fire. The kind that knows loss but chooses growth. Atlas walked beside me, still vigilant, still loyal, still healing. And together, we became a presence, not of defiance, but of truth. Because truth, once spoken, becomes a mirror. And mirrors, when held up to a community, reveal more than reflections. They reveal choices. And choices, once made, become futures. The law is supposed to be the great equalizer, the thing that stands between the vulnerable and the powerful, the thing that doesn't care about zip codes or HOA titles or how many neighbors you've charmed at the last barbecue. But in practice, law is only as strong as the people willing to invoke it. And when Karen sprayed Atlas, she didn't just cross a moral line. She violated a federal statute. The Americans with Disabilities Act isn't suggestion. It's a shield. It's the legal recognition that people like me don't just need accommodation. We need protection. And Atlas, as my service dog, is part of that protection. He's not a pet. He's not optional. He's not decorative. He's trained to detect medical episodes before they happen, to intervene when my body betrays me, to keep me alive when no one else is watching. Karen didn't know that. Or maybe she did and didn't care, because entitlement, when inflated by local power, begins to believe it outranks federal law. She thought her discomfort was justification. She thought her HOA status gave her immunity. But immunity doesn't exist when the law is clear, and the law was crystal. The officers who arrived weren't just responding to a neighborhood dispute. They were responding to a federal offense. They saw the footage. They read the documentation. They understood the stakes. And they acted, not with hesitation, but with precision. Karen was arrested, not for trespassing, not for harassment, for violating federal protections afforded to service animals and their handlers. And that distinction matters, because it reframes the narrative. It's no longer about a neighbor feud. It's about civil rights. It's about the legal recognition of invisible disabilities. It's about the enforcement of boundaries that people like Karen believe they can cross without consequence. The HOA tried to intervene. They sent a lawyer. They issued statements. They claimed it was a misunderstanding. But the ADA doesn't bend to misunderstandings. It bends evidence. And the evidence was overwhelming. Atlas had been attacked. I had been endangered. The law had been broken. And the system that enabled Karen, through silence, through complicity, through passive reinforcement, was now exposed. I was asked to testify, not just about the incident, but about the culture that allowed it. I spoke about the notes, the meetings, the subtle exclusions. I spoke about the way disability is treated as inconvenience in spaces designed for conformity. I spoke about the difference between tolerance and respect. And the courtroom listened, not with pity, but with attention, because attention is a first step to accountability. Karen's defense was weak. She claimed ignorance. She claimed fear. But fear, when weaponized, becomes aggression. And aggression, when directed at the disabled, becomes a hate crime. The judge didn't flinch. The sentence wasn't harsh, but it was clear. Karen was guilty. And guilt, when publicly acknowledged, becomes precedent. The case made headlines, not because it was sensational, but because it was symbolic. A reminder that federal law doesn't disappear at the gates of a gated community. A reminder that service animals are not optional. A reminder that power, when abused, will be checked. I received messages from strangers, people with service dogs, people with invisible disabilities, people who had been erased by systems like the HOA. They thanked me. They shared their stories. They reminded me that this wasn't just about Atlas. It was about all of us, about the right to exist without apology, about the right to be protected without negotiation, about the right to walk through our neighborhoods without fear. Karen's arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a conversation that had been silenced for too long. And that conversation, once started, cannot be stopped. After the trial, after the headlines faded and the neighborhood returned to its curated routines, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at Atlas as he slept, his breathing steady, his body curled a way that suggested safety but not ease. And I realized something I hadn't dared to name before. This wasn't just about a dog. It was about me, about what it means to exist in a space that tolerates you but never embraces you, about what it means to be seen not as a person, but as a disruption. Karen's attack wasn't random. It was a culmination of 1,000 small exclusions, 1,000 quiet erasures, 1,000 moments where I've been asked to shrink. And shrinking, when repeated, becomes identity. I had learned to walk quietly, to speak softly, to explain myself before anyone asked. I had learned to apologize for existing. But Atlas never did. He stood beside me, alert, unapologetic, present. And in his presence, I saw the version of myself I had buried. The version that didn't ask for permission to breathe. Karen didn't just spray a dog. She tried to erase a truth. The truth that disability isn't weakness. That accommodation isn't charity. That belonging isn't earned through compliance. And in that erasure, I saw the architecture of every system that has ever demanded invisibility in exchange for acceptance. The HOA didn't protect me. It protected the illusion that sameness equals safety, that difference equals danger, that control equals community. But community, when built on fear, becomes a prison. And I had lived in that prison for years, smiling, waving, nodding, pretending that the notes on my door were just misunderstandings, pretending that the stares were just curiosity, pretending that the silence was just peace. But silence, when weaponized, becomes complicity, and complicity, when normalized, becomes culture. I began to write not for others, but for myself. I wrote about Atlas. I wrote about Karen. I wrote about the way power disguises itself as concern. And in that writing, I found clarity. I found the language to name what had happened. I found the courage to stop apologizing. I started sharing my story, not in courtrooms, but in classrooms, in community centers, and online forums. And people listened, not because I was eloquent, but because I was honest. Because honesty, when spoken without shame, becomes a mirror. And mirrors, when held up to society, reveal more than reflections. They reveal fractures. I met others, people with service animals, people with invisible disabilities, people who had been erased by systems that claimed to protect them. And in their stories, I saw mine. Not identical, but parallel. Not interchangeable, but interconnected. We began to build something, not a movement, not a protest, but a presence. A presence that refused to be silent. A presence that refused to be erased. A presence that demanded recognition, not permission. Atlas walked beside me, still vigilant, still loyal, still healing. And together, we reclaimed space, not through confrontation, but through existence. Because existence, when unapologetic, becomes resistance. Karen's act was meant to silence, but it spoke, loudly, clearly, permanently. And in that speaking, I found something deeper than justice. I found truth. And truth, once spoken, becomes belonging. Not the kind granted by HOAs or neighbors or rulebooks, but the kind that lives in the body, in the breath, in the bond between a person and their dog, in the refusal to disappear. The moment Karen was arrested, something shifted, not just in my life, but in the architecture of the neighborhood itself. It was as if the illusion had cracked open and the machinery behind it was suddenly visible. The HOA, once seen as a benign force of order, was now under scrutiny, not for its rules, but for its culture. A culture that had enabled Karen, emboldened her, protected her until the law intervened. And once the law spoke, the silence around her began to unravel. Neighbors started whispering, not about me, but about the board, about the fines they received for trivial infractions, about the surveillance disguised as community watch, about the way dissent was punished with paperwork and passive aggression. I wasn't the only one who had felt it. I was just the first to name it. And naming, when done publicly, becomes contagious. People began to share stories about garden gnomes that violated aesthetic standards, about paint colors that were too expressive, about children's toys left in yards that were deemed visual clutter. It wasn't about order. It was about control. And control, when institutionalized, becomes tyranny. The HOA board tried to contain the fallout. They held emergency meetings. They sent out revised guidelines. They offered listening sessions. But listening, when done out of fear, isn't listening. It's damage control. And the damage had already been done. Karen's arrest was a catalyst. It forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. Who decides what's acceptable? Who benefits from silence? Who gets erased in the name of harmony? I started receiving invitations to speak at town halls, to attend community forums, to consult on policy revisions, not because I was an expert, but because I had lived the consequences. And lived experience, when articulated, becomes authority. I didn't want revenge. I wanted reform. I wanted transparency. I wanted accountability. I wanted the HOA to stop operating like a shadow government and start functioning like a community resource. And that shift required more than new rules. It required a new mindset. I proposed changes, clearer grievance procedures, protections for disabled residents, limits on discretionary enforcement. Some were accepted, some were resisted. But resistance, when visible, becomes a map of where power is most entrenched. The board began to fracture. Some members resigned. Others doubled down. But the community was watching now. And visibility, once achieved, cannot be undone. Atlas became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resilience. His presence reminded people of what had happened, of what had been tolerated, of what would no longer be ignored. And in that reminder, the neighborhood began to shift, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. New voices emerged. People who had been silent for years, now emboldened by the rupture. They spoke about racial bias, about classism, about the way standards were used to exclude rather than include. And the HOA, once a fortress of conformity, began to look like a relic of a time when control was mistaken for care, when silence was mistaken for peace, when erasure was mistaken for unity. Karen's act had exposed more than her own prejudice. It had exposed the system. And systems, when exposed, must either evolve or collapse. The board chose evolution. Not perfectly, not willingly, but necessarily. And in that necessity, I saw a possibility. Possibility for a neighborhood that doesn't just tolerate difference, but celebrates it. Possibility for a community that doesn't just enforce rules, but protects rights. Possibility for a future where Atlas can walk without fear, and I can breathe without apology. Exposure is painful. It's messy. It's disruptive. But disruption, when rooted in truth, is the beginning of justice. And justice, once tasted, becomes a hunger. After the trial, after the exposure, after the neighborhood had been forced to look itself in the mirror, I stood in my backyard and stared at the soil. It was the same ground where Atlas had once played, where I had once felt safe, where Karen's shadow had once loomed. But now it was quiet. Not empty, quiet. And quiet, when earned, feels different than silence. Silence is imposed. Quiet is chosen. I chose to rebuild. Not because I believed the neighborhood had changed, but because I no longer needed permission to exist. I no longer needed validation to speak. I no longer needed the HOA's approval to breathe. I planted new flowers, not the kind allowed by the guidelines, but the kind that bloomed defiantly, wildly, unapologetically. I repainted my fence, not beige, but cobalt blue. I installed a bench with a plaque that read, "For Atlas, for truth, for those who refuse to disappear." And people noticed. Some complained. Some admired, some asked questions, but I didn't explain anymore, because explanation, when demanded by power, becomes submission, and I was done submitting. I started hosting gatherings, not HOA meetings, but conversations, real ones, messy ones, ones where people spoke about fear, about difference, about the quiet violence of conformity. Atlas sat beside me, calm, alert, present. He had become more than a service dog. He had become a symbol, a reminder that protection isn't passive. That presence is resistance. That loyalty, when tested, becomes legacy. I began mentoring others, people with disabilities, people who have been erased, people who have been told they were too much or not enough. We shared stories. We built networks. We created spaces where truth wasn't punished. And in those spaces, I found purpose, not the kind that comes from revenge, but the kind that comes from reclamation. I reclaimed my voice, not the one that had been silenced, but the one that had never been allowed to grow. I reclaimed my space, not the physical square footage, but the emotional terrain. I reclaimed my identity, not the one tolerated by the HOA, but the one that had always existed beneath the surface. Karen's act had tried to erase me, but erasure only works when erased stay quiet. I didn't. I spoke. I planted. I built. And in that building, I found something deeper than justice. I found joy, not the naive kind, but the earned kind, the kind that comes after fire, the kind that knows loss and chooses growth anyway. The neighborhood changed, not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. New board members were elected. New policies were written. New voices were heard. And Atlas walked beside me through it all, still vigilant, still loyal, still healing. We had survived the storm. And survival, when turned into story, becomes power. I wrote a book. I gave talks. I created a foundation, not for me, for the ones who come next, for the ones who will face their own Karens, for the ones who will be told they don't belong. And in every word, every step, every breath, I carry the truth that rebuilding isn't about returning. It's about redefining. And I had redefined everything. My home, my voice, my purpose, my power. There are moments that split a life, not with violence, but with revelation. Karen's act was one of those moments. It didn't just rupture my routine. It ruptured the illusion that rules protect, that neighbors care, that silence is peace. And once that illusion shattered, I couldn't go back. I didn't want to, because going back would mean forgetting. And forgetting is how it begins. Forgetting is how systems rebuild themselves in the shadows. Forgetting is how cruelty rebrands itself as concern. So I chose to remember. I chose to speak. I chose to become something the HOA was never prepared for. Visible. And visibility, when sustained, becomes resistance. I remember the way Atlas flinched. I remember the way Karen smiled. I remember the way the officers didn't hesitate. And I remember the way the neighborhood watched, not with outrage, but with calculation. Because calculation is safer than conviction. But safety, when built on silence, is a lie. I refuse that lie. I refuse the idea that conformity is community. I refuse the idea that discomfort is danger. I refuse the idea that power should be polite. And in that refusal, I found clarity. We must remember that systems are not neutral. They are designed. And design reflects values. And values, when left unexamined, become violence. We must refuse to be erased. Not just in courtrooms, but in conversations. Not just in policies, but in perceptions. Not just in moments of crisis, but in moments of quiet. Because quiet is where erasure begins. And we must become something else. Something louder. Something clearer. Something unapologetic. We must become the voice that interrupts the meeting. The presence that disrupts the narrative. The truth that refuses to be softened. Atlas taught me that. Not with words, but with loyalty. With vigilance. With the kind of presence that cannot be ignored. And I carry that lesson now, not just in my walk, but in my work. In my writing. In my speaking. In my refusal to disappear. Karen is gone. But the system she represented is not. It lingers. It adapts. It waits. And we must be ready, ready to name it, ready to challenge it, ready to dismantle it, because justice is not a moment. It's a practice, and practices, when sustained, become culture, and culture, when rooted in truth, becomes liberation. This story is not just mine. It's yours. It's ours. It's a warning. It's a mirror. It's a call. So answer, speak, build, refuse, remember, become.